You don't speak. You serve. The sentence landed like a quiet verdict, cutting through the soft clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of Manhattan's most exclusive rooftop restaurant, where a $900 million deal hung in the balance, and every person at the table pretended not to notice the way Ethan Caldwell never once looked at the staff, especially not her. Naomi Brooks moved between them like a shadow, her black uniform pressed, her posture steady, her presence dismissed before it could even exist, and yet her eyes missed nothing. Not the tension tightening around the investor's smiles, not the subtle hesitation when the contract was passed across the table, not the way Ethan leaned back in his chair with that effortless confidence of a man who had never been told no. The skyline behind him glowing in gold and glass like the city itself answered to his name. He spoke in clean, decisive sentences, numbers rolling off his tongue like they were already his. Market share, expansion timelines, projected returns, all perfectly rehearsed, all perfectly controlled. And when one of the foreign partners asked a question about compliance in a calm but cautious tone, Ethan waved it off with a small, dismissive smile. It's standard. Nothing to worry about, he said, not even glancing at the document again, because men like him didn't double-check. They dictated. Naomi paused just long enough to refill a glass beside him, her movements precise, almost invisible, but her gaze lingered on the page for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Clause 14. A single line buried in dense legal language, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, impossible to ignore if you understood it, and Naomi understood it, but she said nothing, not yet, because she had learned long ago that timing was everything, that speaking too early meant being dismissed, and being dismissed meant losing the moment entirely. So she stepped back, silent again, as the conversation continued to spiral in polite tension, the partners exchanging glances, the air growing heavier, the deal inching closer to a signature that felt just slightly off, like a perfectly wrapped gift with something broken inside. Ethan reached for the pen without hesitation, his expression unchanged, his confidence absolute, the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned, never being challenged, never imagining that the most important voice in the room might belong to someone he hadn't even seen. And across the table, Naomi stood still, her hands folded neatly, her breath steady, watching the exact second where everything could go wrong. Because what no one at that table realized, not the investors, not the lawyers, and certainly not Ethan Caldwell, was that the quiet waitress they had ignored all night wasn't just serving dinner. She was the only one who understood what that signature would truly cost. The pen hovered just above the paper, and for a brief moment, even the city lights outside seemed to hold their breath as Ethan Caldwell adjusted his cufflink with a subtle flick, his focus fixed on the signature line that would finalize months of negotiation. The room leaning forward with quiet anticipation, investors exchanging confident glances, because this was the moment everything was supposed to come together, seamless, controlled, inevitable. But across the table, one of the foreign partners shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the folder, a hesitation so small it could have been dismissed as nothing. Except it was not nothing, and Naomi saw it, the same way she had seen the flaw buried deep in Clause 14, the same way she had recognized the imbalance that no one else had bothered to question, her mind replaying the language word for word, the phrasing precise, the implication even sharper, a silent trap dressed as compliance, designed to shift liability in a way that would not surface until it was too late, until the damage had already been done, until the cost would no longer be measured in numbers but in consequences. And still, she said nothing, because the room did not belong to her, because voices like hers were not invited into decisions like this, because she had been taught, over and over again, that speaking at the wrong time did not make you heard, it made you dismissed, and dismissed voices were forgotten. Before they even finished their sentence, Ethan lowered the pen closer, the tip nearly touching the paper now, his confidence unwavering, his posture relaxed, as if the outcome had already been written long before this moment. And maybe it had, just not in the way he believed. Naomi felt the shift inside herself, that quiet, steady realization that there would not be another chance, that once the ink touched the page, the story would be locked in, and the truth would arrive too late to matter. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray she was holding, the weight grounding her, the decision forming not in panic but in clarity. She stepped forward, just one pace, small enough to go unnoticed by most, but not by all, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, calm and certain, cutting through the tension not by force but by precision. Sir, that clause does not align with Japanese corporate compliance standards. The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. The pen stopped, not because he believed her, not yet, but because something in the room had changed, the kind of change you could not see but could feel, like a shift in gravity. Ethan's eyes lifted slowly, for the first time not scanning the table, not calculating numbers, but searching for the source of a voice he had not accounted for. And when he found her, standing there in a simple uniform, composed, unshaken, he did not speak right away, because the question forming in his mind was not about the clause. It was about her, about how someone he had not even noticed could sound so certain in a room built on certainty. And around them, the silence deepened, no longer comfortable, no longer controlled, but waiting, because whether they realized it or not, the deal had already changed the moment she decided to speak. For a second, no one moved. Not the investors, not the legal team, not even the servers standing along the walls, because the weight of her words did not come from how loud they were, but from how precise they sounded, like something that had already been proven before it was spoken. Ethan Caldwell studied her now, really studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to place something that did not fit. A waitress who spoke about international compliance, as if she had written the law. Herself, it did not align with the world he believed he controlled, and yet the hesitation in the room was real. One of the partners leaned forward, flipping open the contract again, his expression shifting from polite interest to sharp focus, his finger tracing the exact clause Naomi had mentioned, and then it happened, a subtle pause, followed by a breath that was just a fraction too slow. "Wait," he said quietly, almost to himself, and that single word carried more weight than any confident speech Ethan had given all night, because now the room was no longer following Ethan. It was following the doubt. Naomi did not step back. She did not lower her gaze. She simply stood there, steady, as if she had been in this position before, as if she understood that once truth entered a room, it did not need permission to stay. Ethan placed the pen down, not out of surrender, but out of calculation, his voice calm but edged with something new, something closer to scrutiny than dismissal. "Explain," he said, the word directed at her, not as an order, but as a test. And for the first time that night, the room waited for Naomi Brooks, not because they believed her yet, but because they could not ignore the possibility that she might be right. Naomi took a small breath, not to gather courage, but to choose her words with the same precision she had chosen her silence. Clause 14 shifts liability under a regulatory framework that Japan does not recognize in cross-border acquisitions, she said, her tone even, her delivery measured. "If you sign this as it stands, your company assumes exposure that cannot be enforced against the other party." The silence deepened, not empty, but filled with the sound of realization spreading from one person to another, like a ripple moving across still water. The partner across the table nodded slowly, his expression no longer guarded but alert. "She is correct," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just confirmed what no one else had seen. And in that moment, the balance shifted completely, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with clarity. Ethan leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal that something had changed inside him. Not anger, not embarrassment, but recognition, the kind that arrives when control slips, even for a second, and reveals a truth that cannot be undone. His gaze returned to Naomi, no longer passing through her, no longer dismissing her, but meeting her directly. And in that look, there was a question he had never needed to ask before. "Who are you?" Because whatever answer he expected, whatever assumption he had built from her uniform and her silence, it was already collapsing, and Naomi, still standing in the same place, still holding the same tray, had just become the most important voice in the room without ever raising it. The confirmation did not arrive with applause or raised voices. It arrived in the quiet shift of posture around the table as documents were pulled closer, as eyes sharpened, as confidence turned into caution, And in that subtle transformation, the power Ethan Caldwell had carried so effortlessly all night began to redistribute itself across the room, not taken from him, but no longer belonging to him alone. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his fingers resting on the edge of the contract instead of reaching for the pen, his mind recalculating in real time, because numbers he could control, markets he could predict, but this variable standing in front of him in a pressed black uniform. This was not part of any model he trusted. "Show me," he said, his voice quieter now, not weaker, but measured, directed fully at Naomi, and again the room followed her, not because of her title, not because of her position, but because of the certainty she carried without needing to prove it. Naomi stepped closer to the table, placing the tray down gently beside a stack of untouched glasses, her movement deliberate, respectful of the space she had not been invited into, but now occupied nonetheless. She leaned slightly forward, her finger tracing the line of text with a steady precision. "Here," she said softly. This phrasing allows liability to default under a jurisdiction that does not enforce reciprocal accountability in cross-border disputes. Her words were not rushed, not complicated for the sake of sounding impressive, but clear, structured, undeniable, like a map being drawn in real time for those willing to see it. One of the attorneys across the table adjusted his glasses, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to concern. He flipped through the appendix, cross-checking references, his expression tightening as the implications unfolded. This could invalidate the protection clause entirely, he murmured, and that was the moment the weight of it landed, not as a dramatic shock, but as a quiet realization that something critical had almost been missed, something that would not have revealed itself until it was far too late. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition, his gaze fixed on the contract, then lifting again to Naomi, and for the first time, there was no dismissal in his eyes, no assumption, only focus, the kind reserved for people who matter, and Naomi did not react to the shift. She did not acknowledge it, because she had not spoken to be seen, she had spoken because it needed to be said. The partner who had first hesitated now sat back, his earlier politeness replaced with a firm clarity. "We need to revise this before moving forward," he stated, his tone no longer negotiable. And just like that, the deal paused, not broken, not lost, but transformed, because the trajectory it had been following no longer existed. Ethan nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of acceptance. "We revise," he said, his voice steady, and the room responded, papers shifting, conversations restarting, but beneath it all, something deeper had changed, something quieter, something that could not be written into any contract, because in a space built on power and perception, the person who had been invisible at the beginning of the night had just altered the outcome of everything without ever needing to raise her voice. And Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built his life on control, was now faced with a truth he could not ignore, that the most important move of the night had come from someone he had never even thought to see. The room did not return to what it had been before, even as conversations resumed and documents were adjusted, because once certainty had been broken, it could not be fully restored, it could only be replaced, and now every word carried a second layer of scrutiny. Every clause was examined twice, sometimes 3 times, as if the confidence that once filled the space had quietly stepped aside to make room for something more careful, more deliberate. Ethan Caldwell remained seated at the head of the table, but the way he occupied that position had changed, his posture still composed, his expression still controlled, yet his attention no longer scattered across the room as before. It remained anchored, returning again and again to the same point. Naomi Brooks, who had already stepped back from the table, who had already lifted her tray once more as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just redirected the course of a $900 million decision. She moved with the same quiet precision, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her presence once again blending into the background. But now the background itself had shifted, because invisibility, once broken, never fully returns. One of the investors watched her pass, his gaze thoughtful, as though trying to reconcile the person he had overlooked with the insight he had just witnessed. Another leaned toward the legal team, whispering in a tone that no longer carried dismissal but curiosity. And at the center of it all, Ethan finally spoke again, not to the room, but to her. "Naomi," he said, her name deliberate, unfamiliar on his tongue, but no longer optional, and she paused, just slightly, turning back with a calm that did not seek approval, only acknowledgement. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice as steady as it had been before, unchanged by the shift around her, unchanged by the attention now directed at her. Ethan studied her for a moment, longer than necessary, as if searching for the outline of a story he had not been told. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying a weight that extended far beyond curiosity, because what he was really asking was how someone he had dismissed so easily could have known something so critical, how a voice he had ignored could have altered something so significant. Naomi did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, because some answers were not owed, and some truths did not need to be explained to be valid. "I pay attention," she said finally, her tone neutral, neither defensive nor revealing, and the simplicity of it settled over the table in a way no elaborate explanation could have. Ethan's gaze did not break, because he understood that the answer, while true, was not complete, and yet it was enough. Enough to confirm that what had happened was not luck, not coincidence, but intention, the kind of intention that comes from knowledge carried quietly, without announcement, without recognition, the kind that waits until it is needed and then speaks with precision. Ethan nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, but one that marked a shift more significant than any contract revision, because for the first time that night, he was not evaluating her as staff, not categorizing her as background, but recognizing her as someone who had influenced the outcome of something he cared about. And Naomi, having said what she chose to say, turned back to her work, her steps as steady as before, her presence once again moving through the edges of the room. But now every eye that followed her understood something they had missed at the beginning of the night, that the difference between being seen and being overlooked is not always about visibility. Sometimes it is about whether anyone is willing to recognize value when it stands quietly in front of them. And Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built his success on recognizing opportunity, realized in that moment that the most important opportunity of the night might not be written anywhere in the contract at all. The negotiation moved forward, but no one rushed anymore, not after what had just been uncovered. The lawyers now speaking in lower, more deliberate tones, each revision read aloud, each adjustment questioned, the energy in the room no longer driven by speed, but by precision, because everyone understood that a single overlooked detail had nearly rewritten the outcome entirely. And in the middle of it all, Naomi Brooks continued her work as if she had not shifted the balance of a $900 million agreement, her steps quiet, her presence controlled. But now there was a difference, not in how she moved, but in how the room responded to her movement. Conversations paused when she passed, eyes followed her not with dismissal, but with awareness, as if the space itself had recalibrated around her. Ethan Caldwell watched this change unfold without commenting on it, his mind working through layers he had not needed to consider before, because for the first time in a long time, he had been wrong, not publicly, not dramatically, but precisely, and precision was the one thing he respected above all else. He leaned slightly toward his lead attorney, his voice low but direct. "Recheck every cross-border clause," he said, and there was no hesitation in the response, because the authority in his tone had not diminished, it had sharpened, shaped now by something new, something that acknowledged the cost of oversight. The attorney nodded and began flipping through the contract again, more carefully this time, as if each page carried a question that had not yet been asked, and across the table, one of the foreign partners gave a small, approving nod, the kind that signaled respect not just for the correction, but for the decision to listen, because in rooms like this, listening was often the rarest skill of all. Naomi returned to the table with a fresh bottle, pouring water with the same steady rhythm, her focus on the task in front of her, not on the attention she now carried. And yet, even in that simplicity, there was something deliberate, something grounded, as if she understood that recognition did not require reaction. It only required consistency. Ethan's gaze met hers again, but this time there was no question in it, only consideration, the kind that precedes a decision. "You noticed that immediately," he said, not as praise, not as doubt, But as fact, Naomi finished pouring before answering, setting the bottle down with care. It stood out, she replied, her tone unchanged, and again. The simplicity of her words carried more weight than explanation, because what stood out to her had remained invisible to everyone else, including him. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but clarity, because he was beginning to understand that what separated people in rooms like this was not access, not titles, not even experience, but attention, the ability to see what others overlooked, to question what others accepted, and to act at the exact moment it mattered. The deal continued to take shape with revised terms, the earlier tension replaced by something steadier, something more grounded in reality than assumption. And as the final version of the contract was prepared once again, Ethan did not reach for the pen right away. He looked at it, then at the document, then briefly at Naomi, not seeking approval, but acknowledging presence. And in that quiet sequence, something shifted inside him, not a dramatic realization, not a sudden transformation, but a subtle recalibration of how he measured value. Because the night had proven something he could not ignore, that the most critical insight in the room had not come from the most powerful voice. And as he finally placed his hand on the pen once more, there was no rush this time, only intention, shaped by the understanding that the difference between success and failure is often decided not by who speaks the loudest, but by who sees the clearest. And tonight, that clarity had come from the one person. No one thought to listen to. The final version of the contract lay on the table once more, cleaner now, sharper, every clause tightened, every ambiguity removed, the kind of document that no longer relied on trust but on precision. And for a moment, the room settled into a quiet that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but aware of what had almost been missed, aware of how close the outcome had come to shifting in a direction no one had intended. Ethan Caldwell rested his hand lightly beside the pen, not reaching for it yet, his gaze moving across the document line by line, slower than before, deliberate, as if each word now carried weight it had not carried earlier, because this time, he was not just reading, he was verifying. And in that process, something else unfolded, not on the page, but in his mind, a realization that extended beyond the contract itself. That control, the kind he had always relied on, was not about speaking first or deciding fast. It was about knowing when to stop, when to question, when to listen, even to the voices that did not fit the structure of the room. Across from him, the partners waited, not impatient, not pushing, but aligned, their earlier hesitation replaced with a quiet confidence that came from knowing the foundation had been tested, and this time, it held. Naomi Brooks stood a few steps away, her tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as if the gravity of the moment did not belong to her. Even though it had been shaped by her, she did not step forward again, did not offer more, because what needed to be said had already been said, and anything beyond that would not strengthen the truth. It would only repeat it. Ethan glanced up, just briefly, and in that glance, there was something that had not been there at the beginning of the night. Not admiration, not yet, but acknowledgement, the kind that marks the beginning of respect. "We proceed," he said finally, his voice steady, grounded, and with that, he signed. The motion simple, controlled, but now carrying a different meaning, not just a confirmation of agreement, but a confirmation of understanding. The room exhaled almost collectively, subtle but real, as if a tension that had been building beneath the surface had finally been released. Documents were exchanged, hands were shaken, not with exaggerated celebration, but with quiet assurance, because deals like this were not about excitement. They were about certainty, and certainty had been earned, not assumed. Naomi turned slightly, preparing to step away, to return to the rhythm of service that had defined her presence in the room. But before she could fully move, Ethan spoke again, not loudly, not formally, but directly. "Stay a moment," he said, and the request carried no authority, no command, only intention. Naomi paused, turning back once more, her expression unchanged, but her attention focused, because something in his tone suggested this was no longer about the contract, no longer about the deal. This was something else, something more personal, something that had not been planned. Ethan stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet decisiveness, stepping away from the head of the table, closing the physical distance that had defined their interaction all night. And as he stopped in front of her, there was a brief silence, not empty, but filled with everything that had not been said before. He looked at her, not past her, not through her, but directly at her, and in that moment, the roles that had structured the evening no longer applied. "You changed the outcome tonight," he said, his voice calm, without exaggeration, without performance, just truth. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, because she had not spoken for recognition, and recognition, when it came, did not change what she already knew. It needed to be correct, she replied, her words simple, grounded, and in that exchange, something settled between them, not equal in position, not equal in power, but equal in clarity, because for the first time that night, they were not separated by roles, but connected by the same understanding that what matters most in moments like this is not who holds the authority, but who holds the truth. The moment lingered longer than expected, not because either of them did not know what to say, but because both understood that what had just happened could not be undone or reduced to a simple exchange. The room behind them slowly returning to its rhythm, chairs shifting, quiet conversations resuming, glasses being lifted again, but none of it quite as loud, none of it quite as careless as before, because something had settled into the space, something quieter than authority, but stronger than assumption. Ethan Caldwell held his position for a second longer, as if measuring the weight of his next words, not as a CEO, not as the man who had just closed a $900 million deal, but as someone who had been forced, in a single moment, to reconsider how he recognized value. "You said it stood out," he began, his tone calm, but intentional. "Most people in this room missed it, including me." The admission was not dramatic, not softened. It was direct, and that alone shifted the balance once more, because men like Ethan did not often acknowledge oversight, not in rooms built on perception. Naomi listened without interruption, her posture still, her expression unchanged, not dismissing his words, not absorbing them as validation, simply receiving them as they were. Ethan continued, his gaze steady. "That does not happen by accident," he said, and this time, the question beneath his statement was clearer, not just who are you, but what have you chosen not to show? Naomi took a breath, not deep, not hesitant, just enough to ground the moment. "Some things are easier to see when you are not the one being listened to," she replied, her voice even, and the truth in her words did not challenge him. It clarified something he had never needed to examine. That distance, the very thing that had kept her invisible, had also given her a perspective no one else in the room had. Ethan nodded. Slightly, the kind of nod that does not close a conversation, but opens one, because now he understood that what she carried was not just awareness. It was experience, shaped in places and situations that rooms like this rarely acknowledged. Behind them, one of the partners approached, offering a brief word of congratulations. The deal officially concluded, the tension replaced with professional satisfaction. Ethan responded with the expected composure, but his attention did not fully leave Naomi, because the transaction, the numbers, the signatures, those were complete, but this was not. And as the partner stepped away, Ethan made a decision, not quickly, not impulsively, but with the same deliberation he had finally applied to the contract. "Walk with me," he said, not as an order, not as a request for service, but as an invitation, and for the first time that night, the space between them shifted entirely. Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because she understood that this step, small as it seemed, carried a different kind of consequence. It was no longer about correcting a clause. It was about crossing a line that had separated her role from his world. She set the tray down carefully, her movements as controlled as ever, and then she stepped forward, matching his pace as they moved toward the edge of the rooftop where the city stretched out beneath them, lights layered in gold and white, endless and distant. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence now was not filled with tension, but with recognition, the kind that follows when two people see the same truth from different sides. Ethan rested his hands lightly against the railing, looking out over the skyline. I built everything by trusting what I could see, he said. His voice quieter now, more reflective than before. Tonight proved that is not always enough. Naomi stood beside him, not closer than necessary, not distant either, simply present. What you see depends on where you are standing, she replied, her words simple, but layered with a meaning that extended far beyond the city in front of them. And as the lights below continued to move in patterns too complex to track, Ethan realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not looking at the world as something to control, but as something to understand. And standing beside him, Naomi Brooks, who had spent the entire night unseen, had just changed the way he saw everything. The city stretched endlessly below them, a grid of light and motion that never paused, never questioned, never hesitated, and for years, Ethan Caldwell had believed he understood it completely, that every deal, every number, every calculated move fit into a system he could control. But standing there now, with the quiet presence of Naomi Brooks beside him, that certainty felt thinner, less absolute, because control, he was beginning to realize, had limits, and those limits were not found in spreadsheets or projections. They were found in the moments you failed to see what was right in front of you. He turned slightly toward her, his expression no longer guarded, but searching, not for answers he could quantify, but for understanding he had not needed before. You have done this before, he said, not as a guess, but as a conclusion, because the way she spoke, the way she observed, the way she chose her moment, none of it belonged to someone unfamiliar with rooms like the one they had just left. Naomi did not respond immediately, her gaze still directed toward the skyline, her posture relaxed but grounded, as if she had learned long ago how to stand in spaces where she did not fully belong. Without letting that define her, I used to sit at tables like that, she said finally, her voice calm, unembellished, and the words settled between them with a quiet weight. Not dramatic, not surprising, but clarifying. Ethan absorbed it without interruption, because it confirmed what he had already begun to understand, that her presence here, in this uniform, in this role, was not a reflection of limitation, but of choice, or perhaps circumstance, something he did not yet know. What changed? He asked, and this time the question carried no edge, no expectation, only curiosity. Naomi let a small breath pass before answering. Not heavy, not emotional, just real. Perspective, she said, and while the word was simple, it held more than it revealed, because perspective is not something that arrives easily. It is earned, shaped by decisions, by setbacks, by moments that force you to see the world differently whether you are ready or not. Ethan nodded slowly, not pressing further, because he understood that some stories are not meant to be explained in full, not in a moment like this, not between people who had only just begun to see each other clearly. Below them, a siren passed in the distance, the sound faint but steady, a reminder that the city continued regardless of individual realization, regardless of personal shifts. And yet for Ethan, something had shifted in a way that would not simply fade when the night ended. You chose not to say anything earlier, he said, reflecting back to the moment before the deal had nearly been signed. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time since they had stepped away from the table. There is a difference between being ignored and being unheard, she replied, her tone steady. One is about them. The other is about timing. The distinction landed with precision, because it reframed everything that had happened. She had not been powerless, she had been patient, and patience, when combined with clarity, had allowed her to act at the exact moment it mattered most. Ethan looked out over the city again, but this time he was not measuring it, not analyzing it. He was considering it, considering how many moments like that had passed him by, how many voices he had overlooked because they did not fit the structure he expected. And for a man who had built his reputation on recognizing opportunity, the realization was both humbling and undeniable. Beside him, Naomi remained still, not seeking acknowledgement, not expecting anything more from the night, because what she had done was not for recognition. It was because it needed to be done. And as the lights below continued to flicker in patterns too vast to control, Ethan Caldwell understood something he had never needed to understand before, that the most important changes do not come from the loudest voices or the highest positions, They come from the moments when someone chooses to speak at exactly the right time, and everything else has no choice but to follow. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt intentional, like a space that allowed something new to exist without being rushed into definition. And Ethan Caldwell remained still for a moment longer, his eyes no longer scanning for advantage or opportunity, but reflecting, tracing back through the night with a clarity that had not been available to him before, because now he could see it, not just the clause, not just the hesitation, but the pattern, the way he had dismissed without noticing, assumed without verifying, decided without fully seeing. And for someone who had built an empire on precision, that realization did not sit lightly. He turned back toward Naomi, his posture shifting just enough to signal that what he was about to say carried more weight than anything he had said earlier. If you had not spoken, he began, his voice calm but grounded, that deal would have gone through exactly as it was. It was not a question, it was a statement, one that acknowledged not just the outcome, but the cost of what had almost happened. Naomi did not interrupt, because she understood that some realizations needed to be spoken out loud to fully exist. Ethan continued, his gaze steady. And I would have believed it was correct. And there it was, the truth beneath the truth. Not just that the deal would have been flawed, but that he would not have known, that his confidence, his certainty, would have carried him forward without question, and that realization, more than anything else, was what unsettled him. Naomi nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because she had seen that pattern before, not just in him, but in many others. Confidence makes things look complete, she said quietly, even when they are not. Her words were not critical, not directed at him personally, but they landed with precision because they applied, because they explained something he had not needed to question until now. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not release tension, but replaces it with understanding. That is a risk I do not like, he admitted. And the honesty in his tone was not performative. It was real, because for someone like him, risk was only acceptable when it was measured, when it was chosen, not when it was hidden, not when it was overlooked. He looked at her again, and this time there was no distance in his gaze, no hierarchy, only evaluation of something new, something he had not considered before. You saw it because you were outside of it, he said, connecting the pieces, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, not disagreeing, but refining. I saw it because I was not trying to prove anything, she replied, and that distinction shifted the meaning entirely, because it was not just about position, it was about intention, about the difference between looking to confirm and looking to understand. Ethan let that settle, because it challenged something fundamental in the way he operated, the need to validate, to move forward, to close, to win, and for the first time, he considered what it might mean to step back before stepping forward, to question before confirming, to listen before deciding. The city below continued its endless movement. But up here, something had slowed, not the world, but his perception of it. And in that slowing, clarity had entered, not loudly, not forcefully, but steadily. What would you have done? He asked after a moment, his voice quieter now. If you were sitting at that table again. The question was not hypothetical, it was exploratory, an attempt to understand not just what she had seen, but how she thought. Naomi did not hesitate this time, because the answer did not require reflection. It was already clear, the same thing, she said, her tone even. I would wait, and then I would speak when it mattered. And in that answer, there was no ambition, no desire to impress, only clarity of purpose, and Ethan recognized something in that. Something rare, something that could not be taught through experience alone. The ability to hold knowledge without needing to display it, to act without needing recognition, to prioritize outcome over attention. And as he stood there, looking at the city that had always felt predictable to him, he realized that the most important lesson of the night was not written in the contract he had just signed. It was written in the way a single voice, used at the right moment, had changed everything without ever needing to be loud. The question lingered in the air, not because it demanded an answer, but because it revealed something deeper, something Ethan Caldwell had not considered before. And as the city lights continued their quiet rhythm below, he realized that what stood beside him was not just someone who had corrected a mistake, but someone who operated by a different set of rules, rules that did not depend on recognition or authority, rules that valued timing over noise, clarity over presence, and for a moment, he found himself studying that difference more than anything else that had happened that night. Most people would have spoken sooner, he said, not as a challenge, but as an observation, because in his world, hesitation was often seen as weakness, delay as inefficiency. Naomi's gaze remained steady on the skyline, her expression calm, as if the question did not require defense, only explanation. Most people want to be heard, she replied, her voice even. I wanted to be right. And the distinction settled into the space between them with a quiet weight, because it reframed everything, not just her actions, but his assumptions. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, because it challenged the way he had always measured value. The idea that visibility equaled importance, that speaking first meant leading, that confidence guaranteed correctness, and now, standing here, he could see the flaw in that thinking as clearly as she had seen the flaw in the contract behind them. The doors to the rooftop opened briefly as a group exited, their voices light, their laughter controlled, the sound fading quickly as they moved toward the elevator, the night continuing as if nothing significant had happened. And yet for Ethan, everything had shifted, not externally, not in a way that would make headlines or reports, but internally, in the way he processed information, in the way he would approach the next decision, the next deal, the next moment. Where certainty felt too easy, he turned slightly toward Naomi again, his posture no longer formal, no longer guarded, but grounded in something more direct. You said you used to sit at tables like that, he said, revisiting her earlier words, not to question them, but to understand them. Naomi's expression softened just slightly, not with emotion, but with acknowledgement. I did, she said, and there was no elaboration, no detail, because the statement was not meant to impress. It was simply true. Ethan considered that, because it added another layer to everything he had witnessed. This was not someone who had stumbled into knowledge. This was someone who had carried it, who had refined it, who had chosen when to use it, and perhaps more importantly, when not to. And now you choose not to, he said, not as a judgment, but as a realization. Naomi finally shifted her gaze fully toward him, meeting his eyes with a calm that did not seek validation. Now I choose where it matters, she replied, and that answer, simple as it was, carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, because it spoke to control of a different kind, not control over people or outcomes, but control over oneself, over when to engage, when to step back, when to act. And Ethan recognized that as something rare, something not easily built, something that could not be bought or taught quickly. The wind moved lightly across the rooftop, just enough to break the stillness, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing urgent left to say. The deal was done, the mistake was avoided, the outcome secured, but the real impact of the night was not in the numbers or the signatures. It was in the shift that had taken place, subtle but permanent. And as Ethan Caldwell stood there, looking at Naomi Brooks not as a waitress, not as a background presence, but as someone who had changed the way he saw his own decisions, he understood something that no contract could ever define, that the value of a voice is not determined by where it stands, but by when it chooses to speak, and once that is recognized, it cannot be ignored again. The night had already given more than it was supposed to, and yet it was not finished, not for Ethan Caldwell, because realization, once it begins, does not stop at a single moment. It expands. It reshapes everything that comes after. And as he stood there beside Naomi Brooks, he understood that what he had just witnessed was not an isolated event. It was a reflection of something larger, something that had likely been happening around him for years without his awareness. How many times had insight been present but unrecognized? How many times had silence been mistaken for absence? How many decisions had been made under the assumption that everything important had already been said? He let out a quiet breath, not heavy, not strained, just measured, as if releasing the last piece of certainty he no longer needed to hold on to. There is something I need to correct, he said, turning fully toward her now. His voice steady, not authoritative, not distant, but direct. Naomi remained still, her attention focused, because the shift in his tone carried weight, not the weight of a decision about business, but the weight of something more personal, something that did not belong to contracts or negotiations. Ethan held her gaze, not out of dominance, but out of clarity. Earlier tonight, I decided what you were without ever asking, he said, each word deliberate, unguarded, and I was wrong. The admission did not echo, it did not demand acknowledgement, but it settled into the space with a quiet finality, because for someone like him, those words were not easily spoken. Naomi did not react immediately, not with surprise, not with validation, because she had not needed him to say it in order to know it. But she also understood what it meant for him to recognize it. Most people do, she replied, her tone calm, not dismissive, not forgiving, simply true. And there was no bitterness in her voice, only understanding, the kind that comes from experience repeated often, enough to become expected. Ethan nodded once, accepting the reality of it, because this was not about defending himself, it was about acknowledging something he could no longer ignore. That does not make it acceptable, he said, and this time there was a firmness in his tone, not directed at her, but at himself, at the standard he had operated under without questioning. Naomi watched him for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, but observing, the same way she had observed everything throughout the night, and then she gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as recognition of intent, because change, real change, does not come from words alone, it comes from what follows them, behind them. The rooftop had nearly emptied, the earlier energy replaced with a quiet stillness, chairs pushed back, glasses half cleared, the remnants of a night that had carried more significance than anyone had anticipated. Ethan glanced briefly toward the space they had left behind, then back at her, and in that glance, a decision formed, not rushed, not impulsive, but grounded in everything he had just learned. You do not belong in the background of rooms like that, he said, his voice calm, not as a compliment, not as flattery, but as a statement of fact. Naomi held his gaze, her expression steady, because she had heard variations of that sentiment before, and she knew the difference between words meant to impress and words meant to reflect. I stand where I choose, she replied, her tone even, and the strength in. That answer did not come from defiance. It came from clarity, from knowing that her value was not determined by where others placed her, but by where she chose to be. Ethan absorbed that without resistance, because it aligned with what he was beginning to understand. That position alone does not define purpose, that visibility alone does not define impact, and that sometimes the most powerful position is the one that allows you to see clearly without being seen at all. He nodded once more, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, because for the first time, he was not trying to define her role, he was trying to understand it. And as the night settled into its final quiet moments, one truth remained, steady and undeniable, that what had changed was not just the deal, not just the outcome, but the way one man would move forward from this point on, carrying with him the awareness that the most important voice in the room is not always the one that is invited to speak, but the one that chooses the exact moment to be heard. The rooftop had almost emptied now, the last echoes of conversation fading into the quiet hum of the city below, and what remained was not the deal, not the numbers, not the signatures, but something far less visible and far more lasting, a shift that could not be documented or reported, only carried forward in the way decisions would be made from this night on. Ethan Caldwell stood still for a moment longer, not because there was more to say, but because he understood that some moments are not meant to be extended, they are meant to be recognized, and then respected. He looked at Naomi Brooks one final time, not as a question, not as an evaluation, but as acknowledgement, the kind that does not need to be spoken to exist, and yet he chose to speak anyway, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. You did not just change the deal, he said, his voice calm, steady. You changed how I will see the next one. And the words carried no exaggeration, no attempt to elevate the moment beyond what it was, because the truth did not need embellishment. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unchanged, grounded, as it had been from the beginning, because she understood something he was only now beginning to learn, that impact does not always announce itself. It reveals itself in what comes after. Then it mattered, she replied, her tone simple, and in that simplicity, the entire night found its meaning, not in recognition, not in reward, but in the fact that something had been corrected, something had been seen, something had been understood. Ethan gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, but real, and then he stepped back, not away from her, but away from the moment, allowing it to settle into what it was meant to become, something complete, something finished. Behind them, the staff began to move through the space again, clearing tables, resetting chairs, restoring the room to its original order, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place, as if the night had followed its expected course, and Naomi, without hesitation, returned to that rhythm, lifting her tray, adjusting a glass, moving with the same quiet precision that had defined her from the start, because for her, nothing had changed in the way she moved, only in the way she had been seen. Ethan paused at the entrance for just a second, glancing back, not to confirm anything, not to reconsider, but to remember, to mark the moment in a way that would stay with him long after the city lights faded into morning. And then he left, stepping back into a world that looked exactly the same as it had before, but would no longer be approached in the same way, because the difference was not in the world, it was in how he now chose to see it. And inside that rooftop, Naomi Brooks continued her work, unseen by some, noticed by others, but unchanged in the one way that mattered most. She did not speak to be heard. She spoke when it mattered, and that was enough, because power is not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it is the quiet certainty that waits, watches, and when the moment arrives, changes everything without needing to be anything more than true.